Hello again, friends. My name is Pam, and welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, May 7th, 2021. Our first article is titled, A Debate Over Ending Debate, Explaining the Filibuster Fight by Krista Case Bryant. Washington. Perhaps no Senate role is as famous as the filibuster, which starred in its own Hollywood film. In the Oscar-winning Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jimmy Stewart's character holds forth on the Senate floor for almost 24 hours to delay a vote on a bill marred by political corruption. Although he collapses from exhaustion, his impassioned stand for principle ultimately wins the day. Today, there is an intensifying debate about whether the filibuster is indeed a tool of principle or rather one of partisan obstructionism. Supporters say the filibuster acts as a guardrail on American democracy by preserving a voice for the minority party and ensuring that major legislation has support from both sides of the aisle. But critics say the filibuster is being exploited to obstruct urgent, needed government action, blocking the will of the voters. They also cite its prominent role in the past in blocking civil rights legislation. Here's a look at the 215-year Senate tradition and its impact on lawmaking today. What is a filibuster? The filibuster is a procedure that allows a minority group of senators to delay or block legislation from being passed. Traditionally, this has been done by a talking filibuster, as Stewart's character did. Today, it can be done quietly, blocking progress on one bill while the Senate continues business on other matters. Either way, ending a filibuster requires 60 of the Senate's 100 members and is known as invoking cloture. That means that bills with only one major exception need at least 60 senators' consent even to be put to a vote. In the current Senate, that requires Democrats, who along with 2 independent members hold 50 seats, to get the support of at least 10 Republicans. Is it in the Constitution? No. The filibuster became possible by default when a Senate rule changed in 1806 left senators with no mechanism for ending debate. But it is in accord with the framers' vision for the Senate. It is clear that they did envision the Senate as having a different character than the popularly elected House. Senators were required to be older, elected by state legislature, and long-serving, with only a third of the seats up for re-election every election year. Supporters of the filibuster argue that while it was not instituted by the framers, it reflects their vision of the Senate as a more deliberative body. But critics say increased partisanship and the changing nature of the institution, including the fact that since 1914 senators have been elected by popular vote, have allowed the filibuster to be exploited for partisan ends, bringing the legislative process to a halt. The framers emphasized the importance of minority rights, warning against a tyranny of the majority, but they also cautioned that requiring a supermajority for legislation could gridlock the government, as it did under the Articles of Confederation. In the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton wrote that when supermajorities are required, we are apt to rest satisfied that all is safe because nothing improper will be likely to be done, but we forget how much good may be prevented and how much ill may be produced by the power of hindering the doing of what may be necessary. The filibuster was first used in 1830s, then fairly sparingly for the remainder of the century. Not until Woodrow Wilson complained that a little group of willful men, representing no opinion but their own, have rendered the great government of the United States helpless and contemptible, was a cloture rule finally passed in 1917. This allowed the Senate to cut off debate if they could muster 2/3 votes. That was lowered to the current 3/5 or 60 senators in 1975. How often has the filibuster been used to thwart civil rights legislation? Last summer, former President Barack Obama called the filibuster a relic of the Jim Crow era, which has become a common Democratic refrain. Issues killed by filibusters or threatened with filibusters have ranged from the admission of new states to Panama Canal tolls to civil rights legislation, including anti-lynching bills, an anti-poll tax bill, and fair employment bills, though there were only a handful of years in which the filibuster was used more for civil rights legislation than other issues. Critics argue that it had an outsized effect on civil rights. Most famous, perhaps, was South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond's record 24-hour, 18-minute filibuster of the 1957 Civil Rights Act, legislation designed to protect African American voting rights. The measure eventually passed, but was watered down. Senator Thurmond's record still stands and is cited by critics who see the filibuster as a tool of white supremacy. Republicans note, however, that just a few years ago, 30 Democrats, including Senators Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, who are black, were among 61 senators who signed a 2017 letter urging then GOP Majority Leader Mitch McConnell not to scrap the filibuster. How else can the Senate get around the 60 vote threshold? With the tie-breaking vote of Vice President Harris and the support of every Democratic senator, Democrats could repeal or reform the filibuster. Options could include reducing the number of votes required to invoke cloture, requiring that all filibusters be talking filibusters, and limiting which motions can be filibustered. So far, Democratic Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kristen Sinema of Arizona have said they will uphold the filibuster, preventing their party from scrapping it. Barring that, Democrats have one main avenue for passing filibuster-proof legislation: budget reconciliation. Each year's budget can be passed with a simple majority, which only requires one more yay than nay. Democrats used the fiscal year 2021 budget to get the recent COVID-19 relief bill through the Senate despite no Republicans supporting it. And in an unusual move, the Senate parliamentarian has given them a green light to use the process again to revise the budget, which could include incorporating new spending. In addition, Senate Democrats can use the same process for the fiscal 2022 budget, giving them as many as 4 filibuster-free legislative opportunities this calendar year. However, the Senate parliamentarian can rule certain provisions as not eligible for passage in a budget reconciliation bill, as she did with the $15 minimum wage provision in the COVID-19 bill. Key legislation that Democrats would like to pass, but that is unlikely to get enough Republican support, includes expanding federal mandates for voting and election protocols, enhancing background checks for gun purchases, bolstering anti-discrimination provisions for the LGBTQ community as outlined in the Equality Act, and reforming policing in America. Our next article is titled, Moscow Cyclists Are Getting New Bike Path. Do Muscovites Get a Say? By Fred Weir. In Moscow, few descriptions of Moscow, even by admirers, have ever called this huge, overpowering metropolis user-friendly. Its efficient but crowded metro and choking traffic streams move its 12 million inhabitants every day, but somehow make getting from place to place an exhausting and demoralizing effort. But all that has been rapidly changing over the past decade as an activist mayor, backed by a professional bureaucracy, has channeled the city's resources into huge public works programs. And lately, the city's urban planners have put on their green caps, replacing many of Moscow's creaking old buses with brand new, Russian-made electric-powered ones, the largest such fleet in Europe. Their latest project is to construct a green ring of bicycle paths and hiking trails to connect the city's giant parks, and also a network of bicycle lanes and parking areas throughout the city that will enable Muscovites to go to work, do their shopping, or just get around by electric scooter or bicycle, much as people already do in modern European cities. What makes this remarkable is that unlike Western green programs, these initiatives are coming from the top, spawned by a largely unaccountable bureaucracy that faces little pressure from civil society or elected legislators. Mayor Sergei Sobyanin is an elected figure, but elections for the largely toothless city council in 2019 were so severely limited by official manipulations that they triggered mass protests that went on for weeks. Though Moscow does have a small but active civil society sector, recent campaigns to halt a luxury housing development in a historic brewery and to prevent artists from being evicted from their formerly protected city-provided studios have been handily ignored by city planners. Dmitry Orishkin, head of the Mercator Group, a liberal think tank, says that in general, a post-Soviet generation of well-traveled, fitness-conscious Russians are coming into their own, and even if it's not quite democracy in action, officials know they have to respond to changing public needs if they want to keep their jobs. Mayor Sobyanin, with all his defects, knows what he has to do. He had a taste for innovation even before he became mayor, and now he is focusing on ecology, the European tendency to promote bicycles over cars, to make the city center more livable and the air cleaner. It's his job, and he's doing it. Pedal power in Moscow. The new bicycle lanes, which will make the entire city accessible by bike within 5 years, should complement new traffic rules that make it harder to drive cars downtown and almost impossible to find a parking spot. It will also be a huge boon for thousands of food delivery workers whose numbers have ballooned since the pandemic and who are ubiquitous sights as they struggle through traffic and careen down sidewalks even in the dead of winter. We are responding to growing demands for cycling infrastructure, which has become much stronger since the pandemic, says Anastasia Gracheva, a project leader at the traffic center of Moscow's transport department. Our main goal is to create the means that enable people to change their own habits towards green, healthful, and safe ways of getting around. This is not just for recreation or only for summertime. We see this as a practical year-round option that people can rely upon. Until recently, city authorities were oriented towards the need of automobile drivers, and they have built an impressive amount of new infrastructure for them, says Alexei Sidorov, a member of a downtown cycling club. But international experience has shown that bicycles can often be a better option. Statistics show that the average trip inside Moscow is less than 5 miles. If the infrastructure were in place to make it practical and safe, a lot of people would choose to ride a bicycle or scooter rather than take a car. I am very glad if Moscow authorities have the political will to implement this. One factor driving the introduction of new green ideas into Moscow's civil service, which is dominated by middle-aged people, might be the influx of educated younger people who, until recently, did not find a bureaucratic career very attractive. Pay scales have improved a lot in recent years, experts say, and the chances to get hands-on experience with interesting new projects have multiplied. More and more younger people are coming into Moscow government lately, says Ms. Gracheva, who fits that description herself. I've traveled to Europe and seen some very interesting examples. I have also read a lot about new ways to improve city life through green development. I really enjoy being a part of that. It's not a praiseworthy model. The Green Ring project is just one of many efforts that the Moscow government has rolled out to overhaul the city's gridlock. In recent years, it has relieved the city's traffic problem with new expressways and flyovers, hugely extended the underground metro system, and introduced a new city-girdling rapid transport route and other innovations that have won global attention for Moscow. They have even streamlined the notoriously cumbersome bureaucratic machine that traditionally envelops the average Russian in a web of red tape, bringing praise even from some staunch liberal critics of the government. This form of urban government might be described as authoritarian technocracy, a Moscow-scale version of the system created by Vladimir Putin, who has also embarked on a nationwide program of infrastructure renewal, revamped public services, and technical modernization, which he updated in a major address in mid-April. Some experts argue that while the unelected bureaucracies that run Russia no longer have a grand ideological justification for their hold on power, such as building communism, they are acutely aware of their lack of democratic legitimacy and thus devote themselves to public works for the sake of political survival. It's not about transparency or legitimacy. This drive to improve things started after the cycle of major protests over fraudulent parliamentarian elections in 2011, said Nikolai Petrov, a senior researcher at Chatham House in London. Officials recognize that there are growing demands from the creative class, the youth, and others who want to live in a cleaner, healthier city. The message from the top is that you can have these improvements, but don't try to do anything in politics. Mr. Petrov says it's all very well when these big projects turn out to be beneficial, but that isn't necessarily always the case, he argues, and he points out that there's no public input on what sort of urban planning should go on. It's all handed down from above without public debate. Moscow authorities do have a lot of money to spend, but if you ask average Muscovites whether they prefer that money be spent on improving the pavements or something else, I have a feeling they might mention other priorities, since the plans have never been tested in a democratic election. The city's leadership is making Moscow into the showcase of a modern authoritarian state. They're sure they know what they're doing, and they don't need to listen to ordinary inhabitants. It's not a praiseworthy model. Still, those like Dmitry Mendelevsky, a scientist who bikes about 10 miles to work every day, whatever the weather, says they're happy with the modernization projects in Moscow. Just a couple decades ago, a cyclist on the streets of Moscow looked like a freak, and a suicidal one at that, he says. 10 years ago, it was still an unusual sight. Now you see people on bicycles all over the place, and soon it will be the most normal form of transportation. Up next, Orchid Island became Taiwan's tourist spot. Does it want to be? By Ralph Jennings, Yaoyu Village, Taiwan. C. Nagalakop is tiring of the motor scooters and construction trucks rushing past the breakfast bar where he fries up small hot dogs and egg crepes for children on their way to the village school. His oceanside hamlet with just one through street never saw so much congestion, trash, or intrusion until the pandemic, when Orchid Island became the closest thing Taiwanese tourists could get to an overseas vacation. They bring in money from the diving and snorkeling, but affect the rhythms of our normal life, says Mr. Nagalovkov one morning as the engines of a truck bound for a guest house construction site vies with the more familiar crows of the roosters. It's really loud, he says. We welcome the improvement in living standards, but our culture is slowly fading away. There's no more sense of order. Mr. Nagalobkov belongs to the indigenous Tao people, an Austronesian group that has called Orchid home for thousands of years. The volcanic island lies at the most remote corner of Taiwan's territory, a prop jet flight or wavy ferry ride from the mainland's southeast coast. Its azure and emerald shores are dotted with villages where elders visit outside, sipping energy drinks and chatting in Tao, while friendly black dogs, wearing some collars crafted with traditional patterns, run through the alleys between houses. Orchid's few thousand residents had grown used to solitude. A travel ban in the name of cultural research stayed in place until 1967, but its tropical waters had gained cachet among Taiwanese divers. That value surged last year as COVID-19 closed borders and drove Taiwanese to look for scenic getaways at home. Today, tourists rent motor scooters to cruise along the bumpy island roads, stopping for snaps at rocky overlooks and beaches lined with boats for catching flying fish and the flowers that give Orchid its name. Some snorkel in the emerald waters, sheltered by spiky, grassy seaside rock outcropping that invite free-roaming goats. At the time when the global tourism sector stands to lose $1.2 trillion, many residents are excited about the influx. The island's Agriculture and Tourism Office tabulated 313,166 arrivals in 2020, up from 230,000 a year earlier. But it has prompted tough questions for the Tao about how their culture and environment can coexist with so many visitors. Tourists often treat locals like an exotic curiosity, shooting photos of them in their home from the street without asking first or offering to pay. Mr. Nagalapkov is used to Taiwan's main island, having lived there 20 years before moving back to Orchid a decade ago. But he's not used to Taiwan merging with Orchid. Tourists must do their homework before coming over, Mr. Nagalapkov says. I want to make money, but I want to protect my culture. Open for business. A block away, in an alley of single-story houses just off of Yayo Village's boat launch, Lin Chihuyan is visiting his hometown for the first time in 5 years. Like many Tao people in his age group, the 23-year-old moved to Taiwan's more prosperous 24 million population main island, where he works at a convenience store. Mr. Lin welcomed the two 7-Elevens that have popped up on Orchid since 2014, meaning people can buy toys and daily goods rather than just food from a farmer's cooperative, the chief option before. He's weighing whether to spend his earnings to open an Orchid guest house after fixing up his grandparents' home along the alley. If Orchid develops overall, that's a good thing for it, he says. We were really lagging in the past, but he advises tourists to learn local customs in honor of elders and to keep Orchid clean. When it comes to the local ways of doing things, people like my grandmother are more conservative, Mr. Lin adds. Overall, just 2% of Taiwan's population is indigenous, with ancestors who were here before the Han Chinese started sailing east several centuries ago. Unstudied tourists arrive knowing little about the Tao. They do not know passerbys aren't supposed to touch locals' hand-carved boats, built to withstand heavy waves as they chase flying fish, the island's staple food. They don't know that the black-roofed stone houses dug into the earth to protect against typhoons once dominated Orchid, or that men wearing loincloths, whom travel often asked to photograph, are donning the island's traditional attire. Some tourists upset Tao elders by wearing bikinis or running their hands over painted boats that younger men have built and will row hundreds of miles as a rite of passage. Tour guides who have moved to Orchid rather than being born there miss those cues Tao people fear. Capitalism came in when the government built an airport and seaport. Mr. Nagalapkov says, the tourists have upset the balance of our lives and traditions. They shoot photos of boats and might destroy something that our elders have spent up to 10 years making. That's disrespectful. Adding to people's resentment of Taiwan at large, government-owned Taiwan Power Company deposited 100,000 barrels of nuclear waste on Orchid's otherwise undeveloped eastern coast in 1982. Plans to remove it are on hold for lack of a willing to taker elsewhere. Some Orchid dwellers are convinced the waste is harming people's health. Cautious welcome. Not every local minds tourist transgressions, says Diveholic hostel operator Hu Ken Ho, who is a Tao elder. More than half of the island's rooms fill up easily on weekends, and they're coming to look at the special character of Orchid Island. That's true of Chen Shu-yo, a service worker who spent 4 days here with a group of friends. He is excited about his arrival, but acknowledges not knowing much about the Tao court culture. I usually go to Japan and South Korea. Coming here is actually quite similar to overseas travel, though if you don't hire a guide, you won't know where the attractions are, Mr. Chen says. I've honestly never studied the culture. We're just looking at the map and figuring out where to go. Helping tourists like Mr. Chen experience Orchid earns Haseen Lin Shan up to $10,700 in the high season. The Orchid native, who is a member of the Tao group, guides people around a neighborhood of 15 preserved underground houses. It's an enviable income for the island, he says, but it's never certain, and he resents tourists' invasive photography as well as their trash. Crushed soda cans and plastic shopping bags thrown from tourists' scooters mix on the roadsides with the brown glass bottles of the energy drinks that locals prefer. Tourism will likely expand, but a government agency may intervene at some point to help the Tao protect their culture and keep Orchid clean, says Linda Arrigo, an American-born academic researcher in Taiwan who studies indigenous issues. She points to the eventual cleanup of metal scraps strewn along the coast after Orchid's road construction. But once COVID-19 passes, she warns, Orchid Island tourism may lose momentum. It's like amusement parks. They deteriorate and they're left with a stack of twisted metal. Visitors are welcome to look and buy souvenirs, Mr. Hsieh says between guide shifts when he co-manages a Tao fishing boat replica shop. But please, don't throw your trash everywhere. Look to see if there's a trash can or take it back to Taiwan. If you want to take photos of someone, ask first. You must respect everyone's personal stance. And finally, Bug-Eyed About Invading Cicadas? They Might Teach You Some Life Lessons by Dwight Weingarten. In Laurel, Maryland, billions of boisterous cicadas are about to burst forth in the eastern United States, and Nancy Hinkle is getting ready to hop in her car. Not to get away from them, to study and observe them in awe. There are so many unknowns about these buzzing 17-year periodical bugs, says Dr. Hinkle, a professor of entomology at the University of Georgia. Among them, how do the bugs synchronize their emergence? And how do they know that it's been 17 years and they should all emerge at the same time? For many people, the impending swarms may be a source of annoyance or even fear. For her, these open questions enhance her sense of wonder. Only by experiencing this for yourself can one appreciate just how amazing the Brood X emergence is, Professor Hinkle says. I'm going to have to travel 60 or 70 miles just to be able to see them. The rest of us may not fully share her enthusiasm, but entomologists like her say these insects deserve some appreciation and may even have lessons for humans in our current times. They won't eat your flowers or veggie garden. Their locations vary for groups or broods that emerge on different cycles, generally east of the Mississippi River. Each brood is identified by a Roman numeral. Brood X, which has been recorded in descriptions dating back to the colonial era, is expected to appear this month in the District of Columbia and 15 states, and has already been spotted emerging in Georgia this week. One of the things that cicadas can teach us is that we're all connected, says Deanna Beasley, an assistant professor and integrative ecologist at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, who is eagerly waiting to see if the cicadas will emerge in her part of Tennessee. And to Michael Ropp, professor emeritus at the University of Maryland, there is an interesting parallel between human society's pandemic cycle from reclusiveness towards reopening and the bug's emergence after living a COVID-like existence for 17 years underground. What can we learn from a bug's life? Here are a few of the lessons we might draw from these small but active insects. Work beneath the surface. The 17 years cicadas spend the majority of their lives below ground, fulfilling an important ecological function of aerating the soil. In an age of social media, we people would do well to remember that much of life's work takes place beneath the surface, when there is no buzz, when no one is watching. Get out when it's warm. The cicadas emerge once the soil temperature reaches around 64 degrees Fahrenheit, several inches down. For the cicadas, buried below ground for years, the surfacing comes in the spring. For those of us who have been hidden inside, perhaps buried in our computer screens, the cicadas remind us too, as Professor Ropp says, get up and out, especially when it's warm outside. Rise together. The billions of bugs who push up at around the same time do so for a practical reason, survival. When they rise together, predators become overwhelmed. For a world grown accustomed to division and facing significant challenges ahead, the Brood X cicadas' emergence can remind us to rise together in order to survive. Leave your old self behind. Come out of your shell. Once out in the open, often after climbing high up in a tree, the cicadas molt, leaving the shells that once provided protection behind. It's just their outer shell that they've outgrown. Professor Beasley says for people who may be struggling to move forward and attach to their past protective shell, the cicada offer inspiration. It is only when the shells are gone that they can fly. When necessary, make some noise. A primary reason the cicada attracts our attention is because of their louder than a lawnmower mating call, which the males make to the females. The bugs don't spend the majority of their 17 years lives hollering, however. Professor Hinkle calls them harmless and nature's pruning service. Due to the way their egg-laying habits can affect pencil-thin tree limbs, they're usually quiet and below the surface. The great noise they make is only for the survival of the species. So if the bugs bother you this spring, remember they'll be gone in a matter of weeks. That boisterous bumble has a purpose: to replenish the earth, so that one of the world's wonders can come again, to be eyed, examined, and maybe even enjoyed again 17 years hence. That concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, May the 7th. My name is Pam. Thank you for having me in your home. Please be safe until we meet here again. And as always, my wish for you is to be abundantly blessed.